Good morning, everyone. Now, today we are starting a new unit on the Soviet Union. You don't have to put the same amount of effort into this unit, of course, as in the previous ones, and it is sort of not compulsory to complete it. However, I thought that it might be interesting to some of you and that it might allow you to keep training your intellectual muscles by doing some history. If you want, write an answer to the final question in a Word document and attach it to the answer in the Google Classroom. The main topic of this term will be the history of the Soviet Union, from the rise of power of Joseph Stalin to its collapse in 1991. Today we're starting by looking at how a young Georgian student at seminary school became one of the foremost leaders of the Soviet communist movement and eventually turned into Stalin, the Man of Steel. In particular, we'll be tackling the following points. So, I'll give you a small overview of the Russian Revolution, then we will discuss the role of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin. We'll look at the death of Lenin, then at Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin and at his early life. Finally, at the economic policies of applied communism done by Stalin, and finally at the consequences of early Stalinism. All this to answer the question, what were the priorities of Stalin economic policies in the 1930s? Because, of course, Stalin ruled a long time and you got a world war in the middle, so things changed. So, let's start by talking about the Russian Revolution. Before we talk about Stalin, we need to establish the setting of the story. So, the Russian Revolution of 1917, it's an exceedingly complicated period in history, I'll just say that. It has got its own exam, GCSE, and it's very complicated. But it was the crucible that turned the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union, and we need to discuss it, at least a little. So, the Russian Empire entered World War I to defend Serbia from Austrian aggression in 1914. It had, on paper, one of the strongest militaries in Europe, at least in terms of quantity of soldiers. However, due to the unbelievably backward state of the Russian economy and to the lack of a strong industrial infrastructure, which in very blunt terms means that they didn't have enough factories to create enough weapons and enough stuff to fight in a modern war. So these two factors, economic backwardness, lack of a strong industrial infrastructure, meant that the Russian army, despite being huge, fared incredibly poorly against the less numerous but much better equipped and supplied armies of Austria and especially Imperial Germany. Russian soldiers kept dying in the hundreds of thousands, while all the resources of the country were directed towards the war effort, leaving very little to feed the civilians and satisfied even the most basic needs of food, shelter and health. Soon enough, the population revolted, and the government of the Tsar, the ruler of Russia, was overthrown. There was a number of provisional governments which proved unable to continue a devastating war while at the same time dealing with an increasingly dissatisfied population. They wanted to continue fighting because the government of the Tsar had taken a commitment, but they just couldn't balance the two things. Eventually, after another period of turmoil, a communist faction known as the Bolsheviks took power on the 28th of November 1917. They stormed the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, killed the Tsar and his family, and declared that the Russian Empire was now a communist state ruled by the Soviets of workers. Soviet is a Russian word that I'm told, I don't know Russian, means council, so by the councils of workers. It will all be clear as soon as we discuss the economic policies, why all this insistence on the working class. Spoiler, they were communist. So, this was the birth of the Soviet Union. And now let's talk at the man behind the revolution, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. The leader of the Bolshevik Party, which had by then after the revolution changed its name to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was a man named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin. Lenin was not his real name, ironically became famous for someone else's name. According to the legend, he got the nickname Lenin by using the passport of one of his friends, who was named Nikolai Lenin from Siberia, while trying to escape prosecution from the Russian police after he began spreading his political ideas. He was a revolutionary communist and believed that communism would only happen if the workers were guided by a revolutionary vanguard, an organized party. This doctrine of the Communist Party as the revolutionary vanguard later became the standard practice for most communist parties worldwide, from Mao to the ones in Italy and France. He had moved to Switzerland before the war, where he lived as an exile. But in 1917 he accepted an offer from the German government, remember, Germany was at war with Russia, to go back to St. Petersburg and incite a revolution. So the Kaiser paid Lenin to take a train from Switzerland to Russia, go to Russia and start a revolution, on the condition that he withdrew the Russian army from the war. And he did just that. And in March 1918, Lenin signed the Peace of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, which marked the end of the war for the Russian Empire and for Russia in general. Peace, however, did not last very long. A civil war soon erupted between the army of the new Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, the Reds, and the monarchical forces of the Whites. The Reds wanted to, the communists, the Soviets wanted to keep the Soviet Union, while the Whites wanted to reinstate the Tsar on the Russian throne. Despite the presence in the ranks of some fantastically eccentric characters like Prince Roman Fyodorovich von Hungen-Steinberg, real name, and he believed to be the incarnation of the Mongolian god of war, or at the very least of Genghis Khan himself. Despite the presence of these fantastic characters, the Whites lost the war, and communism in the Soviet Union was saved, at least for now. Now, due to the tyrannical excesses that characterized Stalin's later years, Lenin is generally treated as the good one, because compared to Stalin, because he probably was. But his economic and political decisions were at least almost as disastrous. So his government tried to transition from an agrarian proto-capitalist economy, so a communist that was sort of capitalist but still mostly relying on agriculture, to a communist economy, an industrialized communist economy without private property. These, even before Stalin, this caused massive starvation, massive famines in a country that was already devastated by the war. He also tried to spread communism in other countries, leading to a failed invasion of Poland and Lithuania in 1920-21, and to a prolonged period of civil strife in Germany. The soft civil wars, not soft, they shot each other. The low-intensity civil war between the Nationalist Freikorps and the Communist Spartakists in 1920 Germany. So, a lesson that many revolutionaries keep failing to learn from history is that you can kill an emperor, but you cannot kill an empire. The authoritarian regime of the Tsar had been made necessary by the sheer geographical magnitude of the Russian Empire, and as soon as the communists got into power, they found themselves facing similar issues. How could they effectively run a country that stretched from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Baltic Sea? Eventually, the powers that used to be concentrated within the hands of the emperor of the Russian Tsar were given to Lenin himself, who acted as the sole ruler of the new Soviet Empire. He died in 1923, and his last will and testament gave the Communist Party of the Soviet Union one clear direction: do not give power to Stalin. He was, as Lenin claimed, too crude and brutal. But as true as that might have been, and it was, Lenin had underestimated Stalin's cunning. Despite all the recommendations written into Lenin's testament, Stalin was able to work his way to the top of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and become the sole leader of the Union by 1924. But who was Stalin and how did he come into power? So, blessed with the name of a biblical patriarch, Joseph, and with the name of one of the most important medieval Greek intellectuals, Bessarion, young Stalin seemed like an ideal candidate for a Christian education, and indeed he spent his teenage years studying to become an Orthodox priest. That, however, did not last long, and the young Joseph soon heard the irresistible sirens of early 20th century Russian communism. He was close to Lenin, at least at the beginning, and had worked as a journalist for the Bolshevik newspaper, the Pravda, which would later become the official newspaper of the Soviet Union. And for this, he was awarded a position of power after the revolution of 1917. Later, during the Civil War, he was given a military command and was later elected as the General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that he would keep for the rest of his life. Despite what Lenin said about him in his testament, and despite other private comments in which Lenin called him not intelligent, Stalin was able to associate his person with that of the great leader of the revolution, organizing Lenin's funeral in 1924. This was the platform he needed to obtain control of the Soviet Union once and for all, a position that he kept until his death in 1953. So, let me get a sip of water. We'll look at how Stalin dealt with all those who threatened his position and his meteoric rise to power in our next lesson, but small spoiler, he killed them. Killed them all. Today, however, we are going to look at how he tried to implement communism into the Soviet Union and what were his three main priorities. In this order, collectivization, 5-year plans, and industrialization/urbanization. Let's take it from the top. At the basis of communism is the idea that society is divided into two classes: the bourgeoisie, which are those who own the means of production, so lands, factories, machines, tools, whatever, and the proletarians, which are those who work with those means of production, so the agricultural laborers, the factory workers, the working class. Since the bourgeoisie oppresses the proletarians, a fair society for all workers would be one without classes, in which the means of production are owned not by the single individuals, but by the workers themselves, which means, in practical terms, since all workers cannot all own everything, that everything was owned by the government. Transferring the means of production to the proletarians is called collectivization, because you're making things collective instead of private, and it was one of the main priorities of Stalin's economic policies. It meant making sure that no one owned any form of private property. In the predominantly agricultural human landscape of the Soviet Union, where most people were still farmers and agricultural laborers, this meant seizing huge amounts of land from small landholders and farmers and give it to the government. Also, since now forces of supply and demand, which control free market, were off the table in Soviet Russia, since it was now a communist economy, everything needed to be planned in advance. If no one can own factories and adjust prices and quantities and costs according to what the market wants and what the market makes profitable, then it means that some artificial oversight and adjustments will be made necessary. This is why Stalin introduced 5 years plan to coordinate the Soviet economy. He decided, together with a panel of experts in theory, he decided that now the Soviet economy must focus on steel production or on wheat production or on whatever, and they would then coordinate all the different factories and land that they had across the Soviet Union. Finally, Stalin recognized that there was a huge gap to fill between the Soviet Union and the more developed European and American economies, a gap that he tried to fill with a combination of industrialization, meaning that he started creating new factories, mostly heavy manufacture and metalworks, and urbanization, meaning that he started creating new cities where those who worked in the new factories could live. So, what were the consequences of this glorious effort to apply communism? In one word, disaster. There are several problems, there are countless problems to how communism was applied in the Soviet Union, but we'll just focus on two because this video is already quite too long. So, the first thing is dekulakization. The attack on private property soon turned into a government-sponsored crusade against the class of the kulaks, who were a subclass of relatively middle-class, well-to-do farmers. They were not very, very rich, but they were not as poor as the laborers. They were sort of an upper middle-class farmers in a way. They became, despite being farmers, they became the symbol of the old capitalist regime and were systematically persecuted and deported. Between 1930 and 1931, for example, 2 million kulaks were forcibly kicked out of the land. They were expelled from the lands which were taken by the state. When Stalin plans for Russian agriculture resolved in one of history's deadliest famines, which we'll talk about in a second, the kulaks were blamed and became the subject of pogroms and organized persecution. A pogrom is when a riot goes door to door and starts looking at people. There were, for example, pogroms against the Jewish population in Russia. There were pogroms against the Greek population in Turkey, in Istanbul, where they would go house to house, and if someone was Greek, they would beat him, these sort of things. This is a pogrom. Now, as you can see in this picture, the kulaks, despite being normal farmers who were slightly wealthier than the others, in general terms, they are depicted as fat, as evil, as, worthy of being crushed by the clenched fist of socialism. Now, the other, even bigger problem was Holodomor, or the Great Hunger. So, a modern economy is something incredibly complex. It's almost impossible to fully understand and control, even for the more gifted human minds, and the Soviet experts that planned the economy were certainly not gifted. The Soviet attempts at planning it were doomed to fail, and they did. The disastrous management of the economy, combined with the fact that thanks to the growing industrialization, fewer people were actually working in agriculture, so you got new factories and new people working in those factories, meaning that fewer people were working in the field, meaning that there is not enough food. And this is just one of the many, many factors, artificial factors, that led to a famine that killed an estimated 8 million Ukrainians and 3 million Kazakhs between 1932 and 1933. Those are monstrous numbers that we cannot even start conceiving. The Soviet government refused outside help to relieve the famine. Instead, what they did was they insisted on exporting abroad most of the food that they produced in order to get valuable foreign currency, which they used to buy what they needed, which was food. It is considered by many historians and by many politicians as well a genocide as important as the Holocaust or the Armenian massacres of 1915. So, this was a very quick and limited analysis of Stalin as his rise to power and his economic policies. In the next lesson, we will look at how he consolidated his power by killing everyone who looked at him wrong. Meanwhile, try to think about this question. What were Stalin's economic priorities in his first years in power? Well, looking forward to read what you can write, and see you next time.